succeed breeds success. In other words, if you are a successful entrepreneur, you have the ability to attract more resources, right? So you walk around, I'm an exited founder, more people want to join you, more people want to give you money.
Welcome to Brave. Learn from Southeast Asia's best tech leaders. Build the future, learn from our past, and stay human in between. No BS on success. I'm Jeremy Au, venture capitalist, serial founder, Harvard MBA, science fiction nerd, and dad of 2 daughters. Every week, we debate startup news, interview changemakers, answer listener questions, and share personal insights. Join our movement of over 40,000 members and get transcripts, resources, and community at www.bravesea.com. Stay well and stay brave.
One of the things that you got to have is a reality distortion field, right? So Steve Jobs was considered to have a reality distortion field. And what he meant was that you are a good salesperson, you have charisma, you're able to speak about a problem. So being convincing and compelling is a good part of the skill set needed to attract the resources, the teaming, and the customers needed for your company to come into existence. That is only one half of the skills, like yin and yang, right? So one is salesman. The other half that you need to have is you need to have the ability to actually build and deliver the product. Steve Jobs' co-founder was Steve Wozniak, who was the actual engineer. Steve Jobs was not an engineer. He did humanities, he enjoyed calligraphy, he had good sales, but he couldn't build. And he was a perfectionist. And he had this big vision. And I think the difference between a false start and a true start is your ability to deliver. So humility, teaming up, and even Steve Jobs no matter how arrogant Steve Jobs was, by whatever he was, he never downgraded Steve Wozniak. Doesn't make sense for those early days. Doesn't make sense. He recognized the value of Steve Wozniak. Now, don't get me wrong, once the company became very big, then he had lots of engineers, and Steve Wozniak became a commodity. That kind of person became a commodity. And it's like your foresight early is like you need a team with the right person, and that's why you often have co-founders. One is a superpower, is sales, and another person is technical. That's a common archetype that VCs will look for. And yeah, you can go wrong. Like your superpower of being able to sell, you can drink your own Kool-Aid. For example, Steve Jobs, for most people, he was actually fired from Apple because he started doing he was way too perfectionistic about his products. He didn't listen to engineering, he didn't know how to marshal the talent, so he kept drinking his own Kool-Aid, and Apple's performance was so bad that he got fired from Apple. He cried and was very sad, and then he was known as an insufferable person. He would go into meetings, and then he'd be a total, imagine a project work, and then he was just like a total asshole amongst those peers. But then after he was fired, he went to build a second company called Next, and then he was even more perfectionistic at that company. He wanted to create perfect cube computers, and he wanted the robots that were engineering these products to be entirely spotless, which didn't make sense because these are engineering assembly robots. And then he wanted these computers to be square, that the molds that casted his case would leave a corner behind. You know what I mean? Like you actually need a little bit of roundedness at a cast to let go. The company was going to fail, but thankfully the replacement that hired him, that took over, called John Scully at Apple, was even worse than him. And so Apple begged, and Apple acquired Next, which was his second company, back into it. And then he was lucky, but then he learned his lesson, and from then on he became much more thoughtful. And he would always listen to engineers, and he found engineers that knew how to get through his bubble in that sense. So anyway, what I'm trying to say here a little bit here is, as a result, I think false starts happen because you drink your own Kool-Aid, because you're good at selling. And so the best founders have that yin and yang, right? Either they are the yin, and then their co-founder is the yang, or maybe internally, even within themselves, they have that little dot of the yang, which is they understand what is the humility they need to avoid the error. But I can tell you that there are a lot of founders that they can die at a false start because they're too arrogant, but I also seen founders who failed several rounds later because of integrity issues or whatever it is, because they just drink their own Kool-Aid about the fact they can do anything they want. So the question is, how can startups acknowledge these failure patterns early? And the answer is, 20 years ago, you did not or would not have the knowledge to understand startup failure patterns because startups were very new. At the time, the book Lean Canvas had barely came to existence. Then Lean Startup also came out around that time frame. And then other books came to existence like 0 to 1, which is by Peter Thiel, as well as ChatGPT. And then now this research on startup failure has come out only just like 1 to 2 years ago. Anyway, what I'm trying to say here is that most people went through this problem on a trial and error basis. And the problem was that people one person succeeded and they're like, I'm amazing. And then someone failed and it's like, oh no, I'm a horrible person. It was not like, there was no codification of these lessons. When you see founders, you often see that founders are very often talking to other senior founders, similar to how freshmen talk to sophomores, talk to juniors, talk to seniors. You see a lot of founders will often get advice. They will say something like, hey, I'm raising money from this person. What do you think about that? They will triangulate advice. They'll be like, hey, do you think now is a good year to fundraise? How much revenue? I got a WhatsApp message. She was like, I have raised my Series A. I want to raise the Series B next year. How much revenue should I get? So I think the good founders, to avoid failure, will consult wiser people, advisors. And it's got to the point where, for example, even for America, for example, you may have dedicated executive coaches that focus on coaching founders. Because it's a high-risk job, right? If you're a dermatologist, right? I'm just giving an example. The kind of case that you have is laser and facials. Like, it's not a high-risk job, right? So you know that your average job is going to be by appointment. That's why a lot of people want to be dermatologists, for example. So it's in demand. My roommate and housemate in university, she eventually became a doctor, and she is now an ER doctor in San Francisco, right? So imagine if you're an ER doctor, she's seeing gunshot wounds, drug overdoses. Like, it's a high-risk job, right? And so for her, day in, day out, she's dealing with these gunshots, car accidents, motorcycle accidents. Like, that's her day job. Does it make sense? And so so for her, if I ask her, I'm gonna ask her, she will probably know like what the mortality rate is of the patients that happen, right? So similarly for founders, it's quite different from being a banker, because a banker, now your transactions should fail, but then if you're a founder, 90% of chance you will fail. So I think what you're also starting to see the emergence of is that founders are becoming more professionalized as a profession. If you go back 100 years ago, there was no such job as a doctor. It barely existed as a profession. Now it's a very formalized job with clear instructions, clear courses, clear training, clear associations, right? Insurance as a product didn't really exist in Singapore as a profession 50 plus years ago, right? I mean, that sounds horrible. I was 100 plus years ago, but not in any significant volume in terms of actuarial science, etc. So it's become professionalized as a profession. So what in founders today is that entrepreneurship and founder is more professionalized. Okay, when Mark Zuckerberg came up, there was no entrepreneurship class. There was no professor teaching him about startup failure. He just winged it and he succeeded. Today, you're going to see more and more repeat founders, and I'll talk about this later there. But people who are founders will tend to become founders again over the course of their life. So there's a repeat profession in that sense, either on the founder. So that's how they become and avoid failure, is get more wisdom from other people, get more trained, and get more experience. So we're going to be talking about VC value addition, and I think let's see where we get from there. So VCs and angels do add value. Obviously, one way to think about it is that there are two sources of capital. There are angels, like myself, I'm an angel, maybe not as angelic as this profile picture here, but I do invest in companies at earliest stages. And of course, there's venture capital, right, which is more structured companies and more professionalized firms that are investing in probably companies that have grown a little bit further along. So what the research has shown is that angels are beneficial for startups' growth, performance, and survival across both and less developed markets. So startups, the way they did the research was they looked at these angel investment syndicates, and they had these grading, and then some companies took the money and some companies did not take the money, and some of these companies didn't receive the money even though they received a high grade. So this was their way to stratify what happens if you take on a high quality angel investment group onto your cap table as a founder. And what they found out is that if you were a startup that received angel backing, even though you are of equivalent quality based on rubrics, you as a company are 14% more likely to survive 18 months post-funding, and you're likely to hire 40% more employees on average. And at the end of your 10-year horizon, the angel will increase the probability of a successful exit by about 10% to a total of about 17%. Again, this is referring to high-quality angel investment groups. So long story short, what we're trying to say here is that at the earliest stages, if you are a founder, you want to receive money from angels, and you want to receive money from high-quality angels who can understand your business, maybe because they already have experience in your industry, maybe because they're a good executive coach, maybe because they understand financials, maybe they have a good and strong network, but this is the kind of thinking that you should be thinking about at every stage. The next that we want to talk about is for top tier VCs. Now, what's interesting is that the key takeaway here is that high quality VCs add value primarily to less skilled founders. So that's the takeaway, but let me walk you through the point of view here. So a successful somebody, Sarah, as well as someone here over there on left, both of you asked the same question, which was, what is the chance of success or repeat success? So a successful entrepreneur, so you had a successful exit, in your second company will have a 30% chance of succeeding in your next venture. First-time founders will have an 18% success, and those who have previously failed their first venture will have about a 20% success in their second venture. So I would say in other words, if you're a first-time founder or you are a second-time founder and your first company failed, you learned a bit, but you're effectively the same level of quality in terms of outcomes. So it's only when you have been successful as a founder does it really show up as better probabilistic outcome in your second venture. So then what this research team did was that they then tried to figure out, why is this happening? Why are these founders who have succeeded the first time are likely to succeed again the second time? But basically they disaggregated into two pieces. The first skill that they had was that successful entrepreneurs were better at market timing. So they were able to figure out when was the right time to join a market. They didn't join too early, they didn't join too late, but they were able to join at the right time because they were able to join a sector that was going through a boom cycle, right? So that was the first analysis they did. So successful entrepreneurs are better at judging when it's the right time to enter it. Okay? So last year, a lot of people joined AI. Was it the right time? We don't know. A lot of people did. Some people are still waiting it out. Right? So it depends on that perspective. The second thing that's important is that succeed breeds success. In other words, if you are a successful entrepreneur, you have the ability to attract more resources, right? So you walk around, I'm an exited founder, more people want to join you, more people want to give you money. Because of that, this amplifies the advantage over less successful peers in the past, and this creates a perception, and because they have more inputs, if that makes sense, therefore the outputs are better, right? So for example, if you are a first-time founder and I hire 5 employees, average, fine, right? And then if I'm a successful founder and hiring people because people believe I'm successful and will be successful again, I can hire 5 employees, but these are 5 rockstar employees. I'm not necessarily, and maybe both founders have the same level of managerial skill, but because one has a better inputs, they're able to have better outputs and have more success. So the ability to attract better quality inputs is a really important skill set for founders. And of course, the third skill set is making sure that you're able to manage well the team and attract resources. So these are individual skills. What's interesting is that they were also able to separate these founders and their success based on whether they receive money from top tier or lower tier venture capital firms. And what they found out was that if you have already been successful in your first company, for your second company, if you took money from a high tier or lower tier VC, it didn't matter. You were equally likely to be more successful. If you were a first-time founder or you had previously failed, getting money from a higher tier VC increases your chance of success. And I know when we're quantifying some parts of it, it seems no-brainer, because that would be saying like basketball, right? It's like saying, I'm a rookie at basketball and I have a really great coach. Of course, I'm going to benefit more from a great coach. Versus I am a rock star basketball player and I have a great coach. The advantage of performance improvement is not huge, right? From that perspective. I think these are things that make a lot of common sense, but these things do show up in the industry. And so VCs can and do add value as a result. So this is a great pyramid. It's similar to Maslow's hierarchy. So people talk about people want shelter, food, then self-actualization at the top. So this is quite similar, saying that from Partek and Boris Gordon said, hey, from bottom to top, these are the basics, then these are the value add. So first of all, can you provide me financial capital to do and expand the business? 2 is don't be toxic, don't be unreliable, don't have a conflict of interest. Then can you have the ability to reinvest again, to provide more capital, to provide a positive signal? Then can they do shareholder duties? Can they do checks and balances, help with corporate governance, do some of the basic work in the minutes? So these are the basics. And then of course, they can do additional stuff like doing the ecosystem, which is giving them networks and introductions to make the right connections. And lastly, of course, is providing a lot of in-depth coaching and executive support in helping them become the best leaders and managers they can. So obviously, if you think to yourself, famous VCs like Andreessen Horowitz, some of them a lot of people will look at the top two. Most of them will be thinking, wow, it's a great ecosystem for Y Combinator, it's a great platform to meet a lot of people. There'll be some advice and coaching from Paul Graham, all these famous people, Sam Altman, etc. So these kind of contexts that people have, but these are the ways that VCs can add value. And I would say that most founders, like most first-time founders, overvalue the top of this from the perspective, and they undervalue checking for the ability of these funds to do this because they're not sophisticated. Whereas from my experience, founders tend to be much more focused on working with VCs they know will do a good job on these things. And then the experienced founders, because they don't need coaching, they don't need ecosystem, because they already those introductions, they're just like, look, just don't bother me, don't be an asshole, don't make my life hell, and we're good to go. I'll settle my own coaching. I'll pay for my own coach. I'll find my own connections. I'll get and settle things myself. That being said, VCs do have a mismatch between what value they provide is versus what VCs think they do. So VCs, 92% of VCs say that they add value. From a founder perspective, only 39% think that their VC provides average or above average value add, right? So in other words, most VCs are underperforming, right? So there's a structural mismatch. And I love this meme here. Value add from VCs, expectations versus reality. You have a nice cute Pikachu and then you get this hot mess. But who knows, maybe after you let in more air into this vacuum sealed Pikachu, you get a better version of it, right? And there are different ways. Again, we're not trying to get into the details here. Again, VCs, so the question was, what impact did your VC have in the following categories? 60% of VCs thought they were very key and very helpful for recruitment. Only 20% thought that they were helpful for recruitment. 70% thought they were helpful for introductions. Only 44% they were. I think one part that's interesting is if you look at here, I think that what VCs can be really good at, and I think is underappreciated, is that VCs who are helpful in helping them find the next round of funding is really important. Because guess what? VCs hang out with other VCs all the time. We play poker, we play golf together, we hang out for meals, we swap notes, we scratch each other's back. Like, of course, we're able to introduce you to other VCs as well. So I think what I'm trying to say here is like, what I'm just trying to provide you here is what is a realistic set of expectations you think a VC should do. And I think this is a fun fact, is that if you look at founder age at billion-dollar VC-backed private companies, and this was estimated using the year of college graduation, they basically said what age when they founded it. So you can see that most VCs tended to found these companies around 20. So about almost 25% of companies were founded between 20 to 24 billion-dollar companies, which is crazy, right? You know what I mean? So 20-25%. So almost a quarter of all unicorn companies were founded by people effectively around before or right after graduation. And then after that, the next another 20%, another 25% were between 25 to 34. So that's in the US, obviously data, and obviously kind of tapers off over time. The chance of you becoming successful as a founder actually goes up with age, right? So if you look at it from 20 to 60, that the maximal amount of success is around 40, 50, right? Now, of course, the odds are not very good if you look at it, right? So the odds are like 0.3%, right? That's the maximal you can get. So there's 2 in 1,000, so 1 in 500, basically, chance, which is not bad if you think about it. But the reason why I'm trying to say here is that as you get older, you tend to get more experience in industry. So for example, yes, you refused Jeremy's advice to not do finance, you decided to become finance, you became a banker and all that stuff. But maybe after 10 or 20 years, you're like, you know what, I really understand this thing about small, medium enterprise working capital loans. And now finally have the energy to build up because I got my condo, I got my car, I got my kids out of the way, for example, and then you're like, now it's time for me to build. So when you do that, first of all, you have more money, you have more savings, you have more expertise in this space, and you want to build a startup that's going after small, medium enterprise working capital, then you have more relevant connections and customers. So you're more likely to succeed over time, which makes sense because if you ask me, like it goes back to basketball, right? If you are a 12-year-old basketballer, you can't be the world's best basketballer because you're still young, right? But as you get older, you hit 21, 25 years old, even 30 years old, you start to get better because you have more experience, you have more time to understand at it. But that being said, VCs tend to fund earlier because one thing about older founders is they tend to take in less VC capital. Because if you're older, you have more money, you have more rich friends, you have more connections, you're more efficient about how you spend money, and because of that, you don't need as much extra capital. So what you normally find is that these older founders tend not to accept as much VC capital as they would. which is bad for VCs because VCs make money when they are able to buy 20%, 40%, 60% of the company over time. So it's an interesting piece, which is the older you get, the more likely you are to be successful, but then our ability to buy a larger chunk of your company for the same price goes down. Therefore, if you're young and need a lot of help, then this is a good time for us to buy a larger percentage of your company. There's a little bit of arbitrage in that side as well. That's it for Value Addition.
Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this episode, please share the podcast with your friends and colleagues. We would also appreciate you leaving a rating or review. Head over to www.bravesea.com for member content, resources, and community. Stay well and stay brave.